very much. I should say that Interrogator-in-Chief is a nice title, but actually I want you to be the interrogators today. We'll be opening up the floor to questions very shortly, and I'm sure you'll have lots of very good ones. Someone said to me earlier that this current moment in the reforms is the most exciting time for HE regulation in living memory, and that's saying something. And it wasn't Roger Brown either, so I'm really quite impressed with that. David, we're very fortunate to have you here today because I believe you were in the US last week talking at the Goldman Sachs Stanford University Global Education Conference on the potential for supercharging the internationalisation of UK higher education through private investment. And I'd be very interested to hear perhaps some questions from the floor later about how that sort of involvement and that sort of investment could perhaps impact on our quality assurance regime, and obviously the international reputation being a key point. But I'd like to get things started with, on the domestic front, if I may, and ask a bit more about this risk-based approach, which is at the core of what you're doing. My first question, in essence, is what's wrong with the current system? Why do we need to be moving towards a more risk-based approach just at the moment when your new system of fees and funding is creating more uncertainty and perhaps creating a market in which some universities could be weakened financially and fail on quality?
Well, I don't completely accept your assumption. When you say universities could be weakened financially, as a result of our reforms, I know they're controversial and there'll be people in this hall who have different views about them, but the one thing is clear, as a result of these reforms, more cash will be going into universities. At the end of this parliament, there will be more cash for teaching than there is now. And if I remember correctly, I read in the Times Higher only the other week a piece by a report of views of a banker. I suppose perhaps we could take a banker's word for it, but a report of views of a banker saying how the financial position of our higher education institutions are healthy. So I see our fee reforms as an alternative to cuts, not as cuts. But on the case for a more risk-based approach, I mean, let's go to an extreme example. Going to Cambridge University, who just had their second inspection, I think in 4 years, heavily paper-based as well, large amounts of documentation being prepared. Getting them to go through that palaver 4 years after the previous exercise didn't really make any sense. I think the QAA recognises that something so paper-based and so frequent when there aren't immediate causes for concern isn't a good use of its time and resource. But if people have concerns, if there's a clear pattern, for example, of student concern about the quality of provision, at that point you can have a triggered risk-based investigation. In your address just now, you were quite clear that you wanted a risk-based system, but you also wanted the old system of regular audits. Are you pulling back there from what you actually put in your white paper? I mean, it was suggested to us that HEFCE had very cleverly in their consultation kind of dropped the risk-based system, and we're actually going back to what we've already got, which is regular institutional audits. I think they're suggesting between 6 and 10 year intervals. Presumably the risk-based system was to reduce bureaucracy and so on, and yet we've still got the regular audit. So yeah, I remember the discussions as we were preparing the white paper, and it was a lively subject of discussion, and it was one of the areas which I remember across the government we looked at, because this is a government that believes in reducing regulation. And my view then and now was that you couldn't go to a system where there was zero regular audit. The question was how frequent they were. And as I said, 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, those are the type of options. I never envisaged that it would be never purely risk-based. What we're doing is rebalancing.
And 10 years, if it were to be 10 years, if we were to look at the banks, which were sort of AAA rated 10 years ago, we wouldn't have envisaged that 6 years down the line they'd have all gone belly up. How can you, a regular 10 years, it's not regular enough, is it?
Well, there is a HEFCE consultation out, and we will see what the view is in the sector. I think 10 years is an extreme option, but we'll see where the debate settles up. I'm always trying to find the kind of common sense position, and we will see what emerges. I think we'll end up with regular inspections rather less frequent at the moment and a bit more risk-based. As to exactly whether it's, as I say, 6, 8, whatever, let's see how the consultation goes.
Okay. Moving away from risk-based onto this idea of a level playing field for private and public institutions. Talking to somebody just now, and they said to me, well, how many level playing fields are there? 1, 2, 3, there's a whole sports centre of level playing fields in this system. And I think the point they were making is that there are some real grey areas here about how the changes you're proposing will be implemented. I think the sector, as we've known it, is populated largely by charities, and there's a tremendous amount of trust in those institutions, and that everyone is working for the greater good. Whereas if you have more for-profit providers, for example, they'll be working with very different motivations, shareholder expectations, growth expectations from private equity backers and so on. And we've seen in the US, where you've just returned from, when you have those motivations, how things can go wrong. So how will you provide the teeth in the system to ensure that those alternative players are properly monitored if and when they have a much bigger role?
I'm afraid, again, I just have to challenge the way you put the question. You talked about private and public. Let's be clear, higher education institutions are not part of the public sector. One of the things I notice in your great journal is I regularly read perfectly well-argued, legitimate arguments for the public value of universities. I've actually come across very few people who want universities to be in the public sector. So let's be clear, these are institutions that are not in the public sector. So their spending doesn't count as public spending, their borrowing doesn't count as borrowing against the PSBR. If there was a mass demand for universities to join the public sector, I'd be very surprised. So universities are autonomous institutions outside the public sector, as you rightly say, many of them with charitable status. You then have this other group you call private sector bodies. Well, let's be clear. They have themselves a range of different models. These alternative providers, some of those are social enterprises or registered charities. You're correct, some of them are profit-making bodies, but by no means all of them. And my view is the history of the growth of higher education in Britain is successive waves of new providers. Almost everybody was an alternative provider once. Everybody started as often a new incursion into a system. Forgive some people have heard me give this example before, but it's correct. The Oxbridge monopoly was challenged when, because you had to be a member of the Church of England, when secularists created, perhaps this isn't the right place to make the point, created University College London in the 1820s for people who did not wish to, who wanted to have a higher education experience and weren't members of the Church of England. And if you read the denunciations of UCL in the 1820s, it's very similar to what I read in your magazine today. It was going to be I met Samuel Taylor Coleridge, no less, that it would be a mere lecture bazaar. So that we have generations of new providers. What is important isn't their exact, whether they are profit-making or not. Many of them are not profit-making. What matters is getting the regulatory regime right. And I was again in America last week checking up on what had gone wrong in the US, because it's absolutely clear something did go very seriously wrong in the US. What went wrong in the US was a failure of regulation and a failure of design of incentives where these providers in the US could collect large amounts of money up front. They weren't having payments term after term, as we have through the student loan scheme, and they weren't being properly regulated. Through the QAA, the validation arrangements, the power to designate courses, we will regulate these bodies far more effectively than was done in the US.
Before I'll open things up to the audience after this, but one of the obvious things that have happened over the last 6 months has been that the HE bill has been shelved, and originally a lot of your reforms were linked to that. It now sounds as though your reforms are going ahead but without the bill. Are you doing things by the back door? If the bill wasn't needed to implement a lot of these changes, why did you propose it in the first place?
Well, we can, as I say, I've given an example, and let me just flesh that out a bit. Designation power, the power to designate courses, which in the past was, so far as we can tell, and obviously not privy to the records of the previous government, it looks as if it was fairly passive. You can use the designation power much more actively. And we are looking at how our power to designate courses can be used more energetically. We're already using it, and it was an issue you rightly raised a moment ago, John, to check the financial strength of institutions. You can use it to deliver number controls by making it clear that you're expected to participate in number controls in return for designation. And one of the reasons why I announced this review of the quality assurance is we want to check that validation properly works. If there are weaknesses in validation, and we can strengthen that within the current powers of HEFCE, QAA, our power to designate, we're up for it. That's what the review is all about.
Okay, should we, I'm slightly aware we haven't got a huge amount of time, so should we take some questions from the audience? Is there a mic going around somewhere? If we take guy here in the dark jumper and then the lady in the middle after that. We'll take a couple of questions and then take answers as well.
Hello, my name's Oscar Williamson from Queen Mary Students' Union. I was interested in your American example. One thing they've found in America is undergraduates don't really know what they're looking for when it comes to teaching and learning. So the universities tend to tempt them in with things like swimming pools and climbing walls instead of spending the money on the university. And that while this is fine for Harvard and Yale and the unis with big endowments, smaller and poorer universities, which are obviously the majority, are having to do it out of debt and are borrowing a lot of money on private bond markets, which is something of a distraction from their core purpose. And I just wonder how you intend that we avoid that here. Thank you.
Thanks. Should we just take one more question and just do a couple? Sorry, there was a question in the middle as well. Yeah.
Yeah, hello. I guess my question is a little bit broader, really. So, in terms of like, it's such a kind of a time of like great flux at the moment for higher education, with like new funding arrangements, you know, the student number controls, but also in terms of quality assurance as well, because the status quo has only really been like this for 1 year. There's no such thing as a steady state, really, in terms of regulation for higher education. So my question is this even the right time to be starting to think about extending the period between institutional reviews from up to something like 10 years, which would be like totally out of kilter with the rest of Europe, like when we don't know what the impacts will be of these reforms, really. I just wanted to see if there was any kind of light on that.
Well, on the last part, as I said, there's a consultation going on, but and we will see what emerges from that. My view is that there was not sufficient of a risk-based trigger, and there was probably a bit too much of the automatic around, as I said. My example from memory was 4 years. But we'll see what HEFCE and the QAA, what emerges in the consultation. I think there is some genuine scope for rebalancing, which I think will make the system more responsive. On the earlier point, I am not proposing an American system. Our system is very different from America's. We have nationwide, exchequer-financed student finance. We have a good regime for quality assurance. In America, and when I go to America, there are things that they want to learn from us. The Californian state system, which is now in deep financial pressure, I think there's already a debate beginning about whether they should look at something more like our student loan scheme. So I'm not proposing an American system. But where I do differ from you is I have a bit more confidence in the judgment and wisdom of students. And when I look at the National Student Survey, it's clear that the kind of things where there is greatest student dissatisfaction are absolutely classic academic requirements like promptness and quality of academic feedback on their academic work. I personally think that what our reforms will do will get universities to focus more on the quality of the teaching experience in universities. And I ultimately don't blame universities for this challenge. I think it's a point about public policy. We have designed public policies that have incredibly strong, sharp incentives for research. where people compete for research funding and focus on the quality of their research assessments. We have not got equivalent incentives to focus on the quality of the teaching experience, as a result of which, all too often, the teaching experience has taken second place to research. I want that to change. I want universities to think that the level of student satisfaction with the teaching experience is as important as their ratings in the ref or whatever. And I believe our reforms, therefore, are the way of ensuring that students and the quality of the teaching experience for students is put absolutely at the centre of universities' concerns. And we will see how it plays out in the next 3 years. But already, just from my conversations with Vice-Chancellors, I can see that message coming through. I was talking to a Vice-Chancellor the other day who was saying, he was considering how we could raise quality in arts and humanities in his university, and he said he was looking at the idea of guaranteeing that a student in one of the disciplines where a lot of the work was essay-based was, in the course of their 3 years, be expected to produce 100,000 words of written work, all of which would be scrutinised by an academic member of staff with feedback. And he was looking at putting that offer as part of his university offer in future, in a way it's not been offered before, and then students will be able to hold them to account. So that's why my kind of challenge to the NUS has always been, I would love to work with the NUS on the shared belief in how we can work together to improve the quality of the student experience. That is one of the crucial objectives of these reforms.
I know there are perhaps for the first time quite a few students here at this conference. I don't know if any students have any questions about how they fit into the system and whether they even want to be involved in triggering reviews and so on. You a student? Yeah, we have the microphone down here.
Hi, I was just wondering if you're basing the quality assurance, if you're aiming it as new students, prospective students to be like consumers, then I was just wondering how you would prevent that from lessening the quality of current students, if maybe it might result in a move towards improving how the university looks for prospective students.
Yeah, well, I do hope that over time we will see further improvements in the quality of the student academic experience, but I don't see why it should come at the expense of existing students. If anything, I think the change in university priorities that we're trying to achieve should benefit existing students as well as they work their way through the system.
Should we take some more general questions? We have a mic here and then at the front as well. Well, there's two there, aren't there? Let's take 3 questions. 1, 2, 3.
Hi, I'm going to ask this question because I'm not sure that you answered John when he asked it. If this government is so confident in the changes that you're making to the HE sector, why not open it for scrutiny and debate and table a bill? I don't understand why we don't have a HE bill yet.
Do you want to pass it to the person next to you?
Yeah, earlier on you mentioned that a lot of people were considering HE within FE, and a lot of those people are mature students, and you said that students weren't taking on board the statistics and making informed choices. Without question, with a lot of mature students, and being a mature student myself with caring responsibilities, I have to ask if you actually really understand what shapes the decisions of mature students, or whether it's just, I don't know, whether you're guessing maybe.
And finally, just at the front here, and then we'll hear some responses.
Hi, it's picking up on the general theme of the conference, the expanding the boundaries of higher education. I just wondered whether the Minister sees any conflict between his department's encouragement of what I think has been termed the brightest and the best coming to study in the UK, at the same time as the Home Office has tightened the student visa regulations.
Okay, so to sum up, why no bill?
Yeah.
Do you understand mature students, or are you making things up as you go?
Right.
And international students, so perhaps your reforms versus the Home Office.
Well, as I said, there are no controls on the numbers of overseas students coming to Britain. Clearly, they have to be legitimate students with the qualifications and the academic skills to benefit from going to higher education. And I think the system we inherited was being abused. So we have, quite rightly, cracked down on for example, the bogus colleges, but legitimate students with a genuine reason to study in the UK are welcome here with no number controls. And around the world, I and the Prime Minister, I mean, I've been with the Prime Minister at international events when he's emphatically made the point that we are open to the brightest and best from around the world. On the mature students, actually, the whole announcement, the comments I was making today were on the basis of a new research report that we have published, because you're quite right, higher education is too important to be left to anecdote or personal impression. So what I was reporting was the findings of an investigation of HE in FE and student attitudes to it, which we're publishing today. And on the bill, we can achieve a lot of the white paper without legislation. There is always pressure on parliamentary time, and scrutiny can be delivered in lots of ways without having legislation. You bring legislation before the House of Commons when you really need legislation, not in order to secure scrutiny, because the House of Commons has got lots of other ways of securing scrutiny. I was being interrogated by the Select Committee only 10 days ago, nearly a fortnight ago. There are lots of other scrutiny like this, so I'm up for scrutiny in whatever forum people suggest. You don't need legislation to secure scrutiny.
But surely the point about the bill being shelved was partly giving the Lib Dems time for debate of House of Lords reform, and partly avoiding another row about higher education, perhaps a bit further into the Parliament, closer to another election. The Lib Dems already had their fingers burned and didn't want them burned again. So
that's typically mischievous speculation from the Times High. Look, there is always going to be an argument about how you allocate parliamentary time. The fact is, we can achieve a lot of the objectives of the bill without legislation, and as I said, using the power to designate courses more actively than it's been used in the past is a very good example of that.